Okay, and one more button. Friends and colleagues, let's make a start. It's time. Welcome back in the room and across many time zones around the globe online to the fourth and final of Professor Markschies' lectures on the history of Christianity as a theological or secular discipline, and what a feast it has been so far. Let's start by acknowledging country. In recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples' spiritual and cultural connection to country, and in continuing ACU's commitment to reconciliation, it's customary to acknowledge country as we pass through. Today, we acknowledge and pay our respects to the First Peoples, the traditional owners and custodians of the lands and waterways. We thank them for their continued custodianship. We acknowledge and celebrate the continuation of a living culture that has a unique role in this region. We acknowledge elders past and present and thank them for their wisdom and guidance as we walk in their footsteps. So we have been treated to a veritable banquet so far. The theoretical bones made a great soup starter on Monday, and then Christoph served us two consummate proteinaceous courses with historical examples from the early church on Tuesday and then the 18th and 19th centuries yesterday. Today, we reach the climax in the present and perhaps future, maybe the Chalcedonian dessert and cheese courses. Our master chef, president of the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences and Humanities, by now needs little introduction. So please, Christoph, we are all very much looking forward to your final lecture.
Good morning to all present here and also to the friends and colleagues at the screen. Yesterday, one remarked after the lecture, nice, but you haven't reached the 20th century. That was announced in the 19th and 20th century, and we haven't reached. And the reason for was that I was dealing a lot of Harnack, but Troelsch disappeared. So again, like in the yesterday's lecture, we will add something to the third lecture before we come to the fourth lecture. I apologize. This will come today definitely to an end, this postponing of the beginning of the lecture. Troelsch is 20th century because I'm not dealing with the historian Troelsch in his historical works. There are certain articles by him on the history of ideas of the 16th and 17th century. There is a large history he wrote himself. No, I'm dealing with an article in a quite obscure magazine. In the magazine, which is named Theologische Arbeiten aus dem Rheinischen Wissenschaftlichen Predigerverein. That means certain Protestant ministers of the Prussian Rhine province gathered together in a kind of community, and there they discussed certain questions concerning giving sermons and establishing parishes. Why it's interesting to ask for the original context of the paper, because Troelsch's iconic article über historische und dogmatische Methode, about historical and dogmatical method in theology, this iconic article originally appeared in this Blatt des Predigervereins in the Journal of the Ministers' Union, and was originally not a debate between the liberals and the orthodox, which were labeled at this time the positives, die Positiven, but it was a debate in the liberal movement. This journal was a journal of the liberals, And Troeltsch attacked probably to you completely unknown practical theologian, which we haven't to deal in length, Niebergall. And so it was originally a debate in the liberals, and Troeltsch was a kind of a representative of revolutionary liberals. 2 years before, there was a meeting of one of the strongest gatherings and unions of these liberals, die Freunde der christlichen Welt. The Christliche Welt was a weekly journal, not only for ministers, also for the broader Protestant community, public understanding of science. And at the meeting of the Friends of the Christliche Welt in 1889, Troeltsch stand up and said to one of the patriarchs of liberal systematic theology, Julius Kaftan, alles wackelt, all thing wobbles. And then he went out, and the door was closed, and Troeltsch left. And in this context, originally the article stood, and the article was taken away of this context, and now especially that what I would label the Troeltsch criteria for historical method, how to say, develop their own life, completely separated from the original context. The original context is the debate in the liberal community and a certain philosophical background in the philosophy of Wilhelm Dilthey. All things are located in Dilthey's philosophy. That's not mentioned in the footnotes. The name Dilthey isn't mentioned, but if you are familiar with Dilthey or use the Google to look, then you can immediately realize that it is closely linked to Dilthey's philosophy. Today, these criteria are completely taken away from this context and taken as, how to say, as the characteristics of historical method. That's highly problematic. So we have first to recontextualize. The interesting thing is that Troeltsch isn't really precise, because these criteria, these as we deal as criteria, aren't introduced in the article as criteria. They are introduced quite interestingly as pieces, Stücke. These are pieces of the historical method, and the other possibility, how Troeltsch it labels, is Grundbegriffe, foundational terms, basic terms. And interestingly, we are presenting these criteria as terms. He is presenting them as a kind of movement. We are behaving, we are doing so as description of doing history, and not as precise term for history. That's also something, what I would like to underline is we are using the article of Troeltsch in a completely different way than he was originally designed, which is quite normal. That's reception history or transformation history, but it's necessary to know that we are doing so. And I suppose not a large number of people is knowing what they are doing when using it as criteria. What are the criteria? The problem is that the terms Troeltsch is using are not really ideal to designate or to describe what is really meant. The first term is critique. And the idea is that the movement of criticizing all things changes. But what is really meant in this part of the article is that in historical work there are only probability verdicts. There is no absolute, and that's a little bit trivial. We were not part of the murdering of Caesar, so the question whether this person or that person was putting her knife, in the stomach or somewhere else, that probably only the person and Caesar could clarify with absolute security. So the first thing is only probability verdicts, and that's always designed as a clear-cut opposition to dogmatic method. But the interesting question is, I'm describing Troeltsch and not commenting on Troeltsch, but with a certain caution commenting, is it really the clear-cut distinction between historical and dogmatical method, that there are only probability verdicts in history, and in dogmatics definitely not. Last judgment. So my impression is that's a certain image of dogmatics. And it's a certain image of a quite classical way of doing dogmatics. It's the idea of the so-called Protestant scholasticism, the neo-Aristotelian scholasticizing Protestant theology, which in Germany often was labeled, also because of Troeltsch, as ancient Protestant orthodoxy, but what one should better label the Protestant Baroque theology, a quite Aristotelian system. And also in this theology, there are not all judgments and sentences said with absolute security. So it's a little bit portraying things as duality or as opposition. So after critique, the next principle or piece, according to Troeltsch, is analogy. And there is extremely necessary to look precise to the way how he is describing analogy. Historical events are linked by similarity. Often interpreters of Troeltsch's article are not distinguishing between similarity and equality. There is a whole tendency in the Troeltsch article to establish similarity as a crucial principle in history. All things are similar. The serious problem is how similar, and what about newness? Something which is new is to a very small aspect also similar. Otherwise, one could not identify, don't know, a new opera or a completely new style of music is still a style of music. An electronic car, a car. So in the transport system, there must always be a certain small element of similarity to identify something in relation to something else. But this level of asking questions about newness and similarity isn't really asked in Troeltsch. You probably have realized I'm not really in favor of Troeltsch's criteria because they are so imprecise. Similarity, yes, but the interesting question when using the criterion of similarity, is it really possible that, don't know, one single person causes a revolution? Similarity, do we have evidence for something? And it's always the question how similar things must be. And the interesting question is the newness of Jesus of Nazareth. There are certain similarities. The question how Jewish, the traditional criterion, all thing is in the German and probably also in the Anglo-Saxon exegesis of the 19th and 20th century, those sentences of Jesus are original, which are in no way possible to relate to Judaism, that we have happily left as a criterion. So it's quite clear that similarity is far too broad. But Charles was convinced similarity, in contrast to the dogmatic method, is a criterion. And the last one is correlation. And correlation, that's probably the most Diltian, if this is an English term, most Diltian criterion or piece or basic term, according to Charles, that it's always the same human mind, der menschliche Geist, who is always in history and which allows to be identified behind certain similarities. And there is quite clear that's, to my impression, not a criterion of historical method or of historical thinking or rationalizing. That's a possible thesis of a philosophical or theological anthropology. But in this country, how the relation between Europeans and indigenous people, and is it really a sense for idea to think of one common mind over all times? What means common here? So my impression is that's a strong theory where a certain very traditional idea of dogmatics is set up. Dogmatics is obviously something with secure sentence with certain security. Dogmatics is something where it's complete newness, but asking the question of righted and process philosophy, there is also the idea of absolute newness. So the question whether there is absolute newness or not depends a little bit of definition. What means absolute? What means a complete newness? So my impression is it's an article for a minister's journal. It's not a philosophical treatise. It's not the definitive ensemble of thoughts of Church. It's a polemical statement in a preacher's journal, which obviously should invite preachers, hey friends, think about using historical methods when preaching gospel parables and not using dogmatic methods. So interestingly, how this was used, and I don't know how the reception of this article in the Anglo-Saxon world was. In Germany, this is an iconic article, surprisingly, an iconic article, and mostly the terms, the criteria were taken for granted. also in the article, the how to say, strengthening of these criteria is not given, but in the background there is Dilthey, and the idea Dilthey is the argument for these criteria. And probably most of today's German users of these criteria are not bound to the philosophy of Dilthey. So there would be always a need when changing the arguments in favor of these criteria to argue in favor. And my impression is that is not quite easy for most of these criteria. In the broadness these criteria have. Okay, now we have reached the 20th century and I'm drinking a glass of water. Now, the fourth lecture. And I would like to start with a disclaimer. I'm not a systematic theologian. I'm not a philosopher of religion. I'm a patristic scholar and researcher of ancient Christianity. So I'm not presenting a program. I'm not presenting, how to say, a new concept of history of Christianity. I'm trying to understand the presuppositions for my own work. And so it's, I'm labeling it subsequent theory and a nachlaufende Theorie, subsequent to what I have done. I'm analyzing from behind what I have done and arguing for what I have done was perhaps not in greatest clarity, done according to a certain program, but was a reflected way to hold together, as you have said, in the Chalcedonian way, historical methods and principles, categories coined by a Christian worldview. And so what I'm presenting now is an attempt to understand this Chalcedonian unconfused union in a way of greater, it's a kind of offer to understand how we in the framework of theological institutions are doing history. That is the first disclaimer. The second disclaimer is multiplicity of approaches as chance to study the past. Today we have a lot of approaches to the history of Christianity. Someone were also present during these lectures, the idea of, instead of history of Christianity, history of religions, instead of a concentration on religion, history of politics. So at the moment, when looking to an ordinary bookshop, Blackwell's in Oxford or something like this, you get the impression there is a multiplicity of approaches. And my interest is not to re-establish a culture of a single approach to the world. I think the multiplicity of approaches is a chance. The multiplicity of approaches is a chance which is present at most of the conferences, which is interestingly not present in book series and not often present in congresses. Congresses are often still coined by only one approach, but the digital world makes it possible to have the different approaches, and these different approaches are far away from only history of Christianity or history of religion. Because my impression is, I will give now, in nearly all cases, one single example. My whole reconstruction of ancient world is deeply coined by personal impressions, and so the approach of papyrology is a great help. We have in Berlin, in our research center on which is labeled chronoi, time and awareness of time in ancient societies, with a papyrologist studying invitations for dinners in small villages in Egypt. And my prejudices were that all people in these Near Eastern world show up for a dinner at any time, and there is no clear-cut beginning of dinner in time. Completely wrong. All papyrus invitations have a clear-cut beginning of dinner. And probably dinner starts in time, and that's quite clear how to offer a nice dinner when all people show up 2 hours later. But I was surprised, and so my reconstruction of ancient world, this is far away from the question how changed Athanasius in 360 his position, or was he not changing his position? But to have a framework and a really colored picture and not a black and white picture, so multiplicity of approaches. There is no argument against a large number of approaches. And insofar the paradigm changes, the turns of the especially last decades of the last century, linguistic turn, cultural turn, and all these turns are options and should be taken like fashions. These fashions are often argued as the general paradigm shift in history. It's an option, it's an offer, and it's a new way of dealing things. It's quite interesting, but there are also limits, and one should take these as chances, not, how to say, as musts or as monolithic approaches to the world. The next, multiple modernities, just a moment. Multiple modernities, or the myth of de-theologization. I offered in my lectures not a full history of histories of Christianity. That was impossible. Then we would have needed a term to do so. There was no lecture on the history of Christianity in Reformation time and so-called counter-Reformation and all these things. But to my impression, most of the reconstructions already at the market are following the idea of secularization, of a secularization of the history of Christianity. And because the term secularization is so highly debated and one had to clarify him, I labeled it de-theologization, because that's easier. So the idea that in the 19th century and following Trosch and others, the history of Christianity was de-theologized. And what I trying to demonstrate in this lecture is that's a myth. That's completely a myth. Because the so-called secular historians, I demonstrated it, the Pope of German social history, Ulrich Wehler, wrote 5 volumes, History of German Society, and he's deeply coined by his pietistic youth in part of Germany, Siegerland. And so the whole way he is reconstructing society, he's moralizing. I remember a wonderful talk with Wehler where he said the fathers of German social history, the so-called Bielefeld school, they all were contaminated by engagement for Hitler in the early 30s. And Wehler said, but they were, after 1949, all members of the Social Democratic Party. That covered their 12 years engagement in the Hitler's party. And I said to him, quite interesting theological argument from medieval times. 30 years engagement there covers 12 years. The interesting question is someone only 6 years in the Nazi party. He has to be a member for 15 years in the Social Democratic Party. So that was a caricature and kidding with Wehler, who was quite angry. That's a kind of pseudo-theological argument, watered down theology, religious orientation. And so someone who was convinced I'm far away of any religious orientation and far away of theological categories was using a kind of pseudo-scholastic way of thinking about being guilty and compensation for being guilty. So I have the impression de-theologization is a myth, although they are de-theologized forms of history of Christianity, no doubt. But the idea we can establish one tendency as a progress history, thanks God we are now de-theologized, or as history of decline, what a pity. That's a simplification of development. There were attempts also in pagan antiquity when comparing Herodot with Thucydides. Thucydides tried definitely to de-theologize history. He was not really successful in doing so. I don't want to present de-theologization of history or of doing history as unavoidable. My interest is only there were from the beginning on people interested to de-theologize history and others to present a kind of history of Christianity from a religious or theological perspective. And in certain times, one group is stronger, in certain times not. But the idea to construct a clear-cut development in a certain direction is a myth. That's one of the key theses of these lectures. And one could argue in favor of this. And multiple modernities means we should avoid the Schmuel-Eisenstadt concept. We should avoid to judge a certain form as progress and another form as regression. Because my impression is to judge a historical reconstruction, not the question, is it done on the basis of a Christian worldview or of a pagan worldview or of a Buddhist worldview is of interest, but of interest is the question, is the reconstruction of history convincing or not? That's the only question. And So probably certain reconstructions are, how to say, there is a certain possibility that the inner view helps to understand, for example, Protestants and Egyptian monasticism. Most Protestant reconstructions are coined by a certain impression of aliens, because those Protestants had no idea why someone could be motivated to become a monk. But on the other side, from time to time, it helps if someone looks from outside to the phenomenon of Egyptian monasticism, because he's perhaps able to identify the lines linking Egyptian monasticism and Neoplatonic asceticism. So my impression is that there is no judgment of higher or lower, but as I said before, the multiplicity is a chance, and it's better to have an unhierarchized number of approaches to history. And to those who are convinced their form of de-theologized or theologized history of Christianity is of higher value than others, you have to argue, and you have to be yourself in the modest way presenting yourself as one option in the large, how to say, in the large competition, who is able to explain something better than others. And the last thing I would like to argue for is the Chalcedonian idea. And I'm doing this by discussing the Chalcedonian adverbs, because that helps to clarify a little bit. What's the question of unity? That's probably quite clear to you. Historical method, and that's one nature of history of Christianity approaches. So one nature, so to label it, historical method, and the other thing, categories from a Christian or from another worldview. What means unconfused unity? That means at first without division. And without division means transparency. I've always the impression that history of Christianity with categories coined by a Christian worldview offer the chance to be transparent. Wheeler, the father of German social history, wasn't transparent. He declared, I have no religious orientation, and in fact, he was coined by some watered down ideas of how to deal with people who had a certain form of being guilty of certain actions in the 30s and 40s of the last century. So doing history of Christianity in an unconfused union means to have the chance to be more transparent than on others. It's clear what is done here is done with certain categories. And one is able to present those categories in the first hour of a term, in the prefaces of a book, or wherever. And to remember great historians of the last century, it was quite clear when reading texts of Henry Chadwick that Henry Chadwick was a historian coined by a certain Anglo-Catholic approach to the world. That was quite clear because there were clear-cut and transparent forms of not to hide and not to divide. Chadwick was as theologian historian and as historian theologian. And that was quite clear, and everyone could stop consenting Chadwick when getting the impression that is misleading or brought him to argue for things or to establish things stronger than they were in history or whatever. So the next, without separation, without division and without separation, my impression is when using the categories in a reflected way, one can use them as chants because Trinitarian controversy of the 4th century, if one is thinking about how Trinity could be organized, it's easier to understand the highly difficult way of discussion in the 4th century. So without division and without separation. I have certain problems with without change because I think historical method and also the categories coined by a Christian worldview are to a certain extent changing and to a certain extent unchangeable. That means there will be probably unchangeable items of a historical method that history has to ask for sources to clarify whether certain things from the past are sources and in which way they are sources. These are unchangeable elements. But for example, the question whether we can use certain techniques of the digital world to interpret fragments as authentic or not authentic. I remember that at the beginning, those digital techniques were highly problematic. People explaining, this is definitely origin. No. Very laic ways of approaching. Now you get the impression these possibilities to describe via digital techniques the practice of language of individuals and to identify in the Catena material texts as texts of origin increased, became better. And so there are definitely changes in historical method. The linguistic analysis on the DH basis are part of the historical method. I delivered at the Origin Congress the question how one can describe origin style as tentative. And that's a question where you need linguistic help. Here one can perhaps interpret a text as is this characteristic of a commentary or of origin. That can be analyzed with the help of digital humanities without problem. And the interesting question, is there progress in the Christian worldview? Development. The question of female priests in certain churches. and many other questions. So I have the impression, but that's not really surprising, Chalcedon is a metaphor. It's not possible to use a model for God in worldly circumstances without any change. But the model helps to clarify that the tranche duo between historical method and dogmatic method is in no way. When Tranche was professor for systematic theology, there were no female ministers in Protestant churches. So the idea of dogmatics Tranche had was perhaps for a certain approach in his time correct, definitely not in Roman Catholic or Protestant thinking of today. And the last thing, without confusion, and that's extremely that extremely matters. The versus thing one could have in a history of Christianity approach in a theological department or faculty is a mixo-philologia theologia, or a mixo-historia theologia. That's the versus thing, what can happen. So I'm so extremely in favor of the what is in the Greek language labeled asynchitos enosis. Hyo means mix things together, and that's taken from a Stoic theory of possible ways, that there is the possibility to have things set next to each other without union, parathesis in Greek. There are things mixed together, and there is the unmixed, unconfused unity in between. When cherry and banana are put in one glass. That's the way I'm explaining that to my students. It's not only something from the Stoics, but it's all-day experience of students in the cafeteria. Cherry and banana in one glass. Unconfused unity. And that means that there is a certain way of difference between historical method and the question of principles or categories coined by a Christian worldview. And there are certain questions one has to ask, which, how to say, as a temptation, offer the danger of a mixo historia or philologia theologia. This is, for example, the question of God's action. But it's necessary to be, how to say, to be still in the framework of this Chalcedonian unconfused, unmixed unity to ask the question for both parts, for both natures, differently, and perhaps also to answer differently. There is no need to produce one single answer from both sides. And because of these unmixed unity, one can be quite open. I'm able to integrate in my historical method new paradigms. I'm able to integrate in such a form different forms of theology. Theology of a Northern Baptist university like Chicago, of a Roman Catholic university, of a German Protestant university, because the Chalcedonian unmixed, unconfused unity is open to, because it's a structure. It's defined by a structure and not by a content. The interest I have is the structural arrangement of these two natures of history of Christianity approach from a Christian worldview and not a specific Christian worldview. And to have the opportunity to discuss a little bit longer, I close so that we have today not only half an hour, but nearly 45 minutes, 40 minutes for discussion, as I promised. And I would like at the end to thank, it was a wonderful opportunity to present my ideas to you because of your quite interesting questions, of your curiosity, of your hospitality. That is a moving impression, and many, many thanks for that wonderful reception of someone being the first time in Australia and deeply impressed of your institute, of the university, and of this wonderful round, and also the people at the screen. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Christoph, for such a nourishing final Chalcedonian course, perhaps a trifle, it's not split. Plenty of time for questions. Let's try and alternate between in the room and online. As before, in the room, obviously, wave at me. Online, use the raise hand function or put your question in chat, and Jonathan will kindly relay it. And please, as you start your question, tell us who you are and your institutions, so Christoph can continue to get to know us. Thank you. So who would like to kick off? Catherine.
Hello, thank you. I'm Catherine Plaist, Catholic Theological College, University of Divinity. When you talked about multiple modernities, you said that the writers of history can have various religious worldviews, but that when we're reading it, when we're assessing that history, what is important is whether it's convincing, I think. And what I wanted to ask is that when we read it, we also may have some sort of religious worldview. Doesn't that worldview of the interpreter also affect what we regard as convincing?
For sure, for sure. But how to explain? If things went the right way, my horizon is corrected at a certain point. And so there is no absolute security. That's an implication of the from Schwalch, I think correctly described characteristics of historical method. There is no absolute security in the judgment that's convincing. And I have to confess, and that's probably the experience of all of us, that things are changing. I've found certain things more convincing in the early years, and now I'm for certain reasons I changed. So the interesting question is openness. Is one willing to let certain ideas be changed or not? And a certain form of how to say Standortgebundenheit, that one has a certain point from which one is looking to the world, that's unavoidable.
A question from online, Jonathan?
Yes, Chris Walker has a question.
Chris, please.
Hi, Christoph. What a wonderful lecture, very intriguing, so thought-provoking on so many levels. I wanted to ask just a very little question regarding your use of the Chalcedonian metaphor. And the question is, would you want to add a little bit of teleology into your concept of the distinctive unity and diversity, the way you're using it in two different orientations, theological and historical? And what I'm wondering, as you say this, I'm provoked to think of the Chalcedonian notion of an unmixed union has the particular purpose of human redemption. So there is this strong teleological orientation that, and I wonder if you have a kind of epistemological analog to that. So what is exactly the benefit to us by keeping these two things separate, yet insisting that they are unified?
I'm not quite sure whether I have completely understood your question. What is the benefit of?
Yes, so what I'm finding most intriguing about what you're saying is you're recognizing a long-term distinction between ways of thinking about the past in theology and in history. So that's a given. You're insisting that they are a unity, but they are distinct and unmixed. So you might say they have distinctive logics, two different logics. But why exactly would I not just choose one over against the other? Why do I need to keep these two together? And the analogy of the Chalcedonian Christology is, well, that has a specific theological purpose. I understand that. What's this purpose?
Yes, wonderful. Thank you. Probably this is the question where the community of historians will be divided in answering. A large number of historians will answer there is no benefit, and that one has to accept. And probably also a certain number of historians will declare it's a danger to unify these. I would argue for a benefit, and I have to argue for a benefit to counter-argue those who are convinced it's a danger. And my idea is one thing I have already mentioned. To my impression, people thinking about these two from the viewpoint of a Christian worldview are the most transparent historians. Because all the other historians who are, I should have started at another point. I'm always convinced there are always two. There is always a historical method and a certain form of unexpressed categories which are coining. So what I presented in the first lecture, these order chaos, every historian has something. There is always a unity of two in mind. And so the Chalcedonian structure is not characteristic only for people doing this from the background of a Christian worldview. The benefit to think about these two is to be transparent on the general paradigms of reconstructing the past. Because my impression is always, when comparing certain approaches, the question is the history of Germany in the 20th century, the disaster should it be explained because of individuals? Is it Emperor Wilhelm who brought catastrophe into European politics, or is it a certain social stratum? Is it? These are questions which are related to fundamental principles of reconstructing the past, and the benefit of addressing these general principles, the discussion about historical reconstructions is easier. If it's clear that I'm interested in individuals and society is of lesser interest for me, it's quite clear why I'm presenting Emperor Wilhelm and not the German army, the German nobility, the society of the German Empire, or whatever. Because people doing it from the background of a Christian worldview and having studied theology, or doing to a certain extent theology, are trained to express and to explain these basic principles. And that's the benefit.
Let me follow up with a brief question on that. That's very intriguing. Thank you. And it makes perfectly good sense. Would you go so far as to say that that realm of presuppositions that the agnostic historian who thinks he's just describing objective past entertains without acknowledgement, and the theologian are in both cases a matter of belief?
Yes, sure.
Okay.
Of course, my impression is this idea of Ranke, this whole classical German school is deeply coined by certain theological principles. Ranke's wonderful sentence, history as the hieroglyph of God. That's a theological concept. So I have the impression always beliefs and worldviews are structuring, and my Chalcedonian model is not only for people with a Christian worldview or with a theologically framed Christian worldview, that should be used for every historian. And only these unenlightened, I'm a little bit provocative, those unenlightened people thinking I'm a pure objective historian, they probably, but they are dying out. When I was a young student, the number of these pure objective approach to were far more spread in the history institutes than they are today.
Thank you very much.
Oh, yes, thank you so much. And thank you again, Professor Markschies. My question is about the de-theologizers. And although I can agree that de-theologization is a myth, I wonder if there's not some ambiguity here, or whether you would acknowledge a distinction, because it seems to me that I'll just call them the non-religious historians aren't really trying to consciously uproot all their theological or perhaps metaphysical presuppositions when they're doing history. They're simply making the conscious effort not to present God or gods as historical agents. And I just wondered if you would acknowledge that distinction or have another way of viewing it.
When analyzing, I'm not a systematic theologian, concepts of God's action in contemporary theology, you got the impression that a larger number of systematic theologians are describing, are avoiding to present God as an actor or God's action as in any form comparable to human action. So there is a form, for example, Christoph, not Christopher Steed, the colleague of Henry Chadwick, a wonderful, Morris Wilde's lecture on God's action, and how he defined God's action is that a certain word transmitted as God's word is acting in a certain sense, and that the action of a word is always linked with a human action. Leave immediately the room, there is fire in the house. Yes, to a certain extent, the sentence, leave the room, there is fire in the house, is acting, but it's only acting because I have spoken, or probably not I, someone else is coming into the room. So my impression is a naive idea of God's action should be modeled like a human's action, like in Greek mythology or in certain Christian forms of religion. The distancing from this simple model is nothing which helps to differentiate between one group and another group, because my impression is that there is a certain form of distancing from popular piety or popular ideas of Zeus is an actor like I myself, or hopefully not, because he's always interested in immoral relations. But that he is like a human actor. There is a heavy debate in antiquity about how one can allegorize these stories to avoid unfriendly ideas about the gods. So I think the theologizing is the idea of that there is a certain form of clear-cut and identifiable tendency of secularization of history, of history writing. And my impression is like the paradigm of secularization covers certain developments, yes, definitely, but it's as a general theory highly problematic. And so,
Thank you. This is actually a question from me, not from online. No one else would want to take credit for this, I'm sure. I'm going to try and make it. Okay, there's a strong and a weak way, I think, of taking your claim about historians who believe themselves to be de-theologized, who think that what they're doing is without theology. Yeah. The weak version is that, well, you know, they grew up, they probably have a Christian background, they've got certain moral ideas they can't really get away from. Mm-hmm. You know, of course, you could confront someone and say, well, look what you're doing. They say, oh, fair point. I will change the way I do it to you know, question those values. I think that would be possible. There's a strong, very strong form of this claim that I wonder about, which is that, in fact, from a theological perspective, it is impossible for them to be disentangled because the fact of God is not something they can actually get rid of. But that's not something that they would accept. And so does this lead to a kind of incommensurability between the historian who operates from within, as you say, a Christian worldview, which accepts or perhaps even demands that not just that God be an actor, but that the fact of God's action informs the way in which human thought takes place, so that the creation of a narrative of events will always be informed by this, whether you want it to be or not. Now, that's a theological claim about how history is going to be written, however one thinks one's writing it. But does this lead to an incommensurability with someone, say, from the outside of that worldview who says, well, no, that's absolutely not what's happening here? And can they even speak to each other about what history is? Does that make sense as a question?
For sure. But I would hesitate to label the first explanation as weak, because that a certain form of distancing from religious backgrounds is possible. I wouldn't deny. Velo, my talk was Velo. And the question whether 30 years membership in the Social Democratic Party covers and so far, one could imagine that Velo would have answered, oh, that's related to my pietistic past in Siegerland, and I should correct. That, I think, is an acceptable form of de-theologization or covering or removing the religious background. The next question is, what's coming instead? Because my answer to Chris Ocker, there are always guiding principles of reconstruction. And Velo changed because in the first volumes, individuals played no role. And the last volume, Hitler suddenly played a central role. So he obviously changed, because I could explain also the history of the early 20th century by Emperor Wilhelm, by certain people in the army and so far. Why this changed? And my impression is people trained in a theology department or in a philosophy department are easier able to answer and to analyze their own meta-historical changings or changings of meta-historical principles. The other question, whether that looks a little bit what you presented as the strong explanation as mixo theologia historia, because I have the impression, my own impression whether people could really escape, so to say, I would never ever bring into a conversation with atheistic, agnostic, or whatever historians.
What if I called it a communicatio idiomaticus? You wouldn't say it, but you might think it.
I have to think about it.
Very fair. Thank you very much.
Is there a question from online, Jonathan?
Not at the moment.
Christoph, can I try out with you a more heretical model of a confused unity between theology and history? It's very much related to the questions that David and Jonathan have asked. So let me start with an example. I was once an examiner for a doctoral student who was a historian who did research into the Flemish religious during the Second World War and how they've collaborated with the Germans. Mm-hmm. And they did so, quite a few of them, and especially the Dominicans and the Capuchins, because they were Flemish nationalists and they thought that the Germans were going to help them to constitute an independent Flanders. And so my question to the student was, so where do you stand? And the reason why I was asking that was a young Dominican, and he was wearing the habit. And I thought, well, so what do you make of this yourself? And he came out himself as being a Flemish nationalist in those days. So I was very curious. What is your judgment on these religions during the Second World War? And then he, I think, was not prepared for this question, but answered fairly quickly and said, well, de geschiedenis zal oordelen in Dutch. Die Geschichte wird urteilen. History will judge. And I thought that was on the one hand, perhaps a very lazy answer, because I think he didn't want to answer that question. But at the same time, it was a very interesting question, because if it is true that history will judge, then might it be the case that there is an internal normativity that is carried within history itself? And if that is the case, then theologians do not have to add a normativity or a worldview that adds a judgment to history. And that means that the study of history will, in some sense, uncover the inherent normativity in history, so that history can actually do the judging work that was suggested here by the student. And I think that there is some truth in that. And so the reason why I was saying, trying out the heretical model of a confused unity here is, does this mean that, could this mean that Christian faith is not a worldview, not a perspective, not something that we add to it or something that determines our method, but something that we borrow or that we find in history? So faith that is a given reality in history that feeds our perspectives and feeds our worldviews, rather than we have to add it methodically to history. I hope that's a clear question.
That's far more than a question. That's an alternative approach. Yes and no. I'm starting with a yes. For a Christian, history is always a possibility to feed and to enrich faith. Yes, for sure. Studying, don't know. I'm quite sure that my own. I studied at the beginning of the 21st century in the framework of my book on institutions of theology, liturgy, which is not a part of a traditional training in a Protestant faculty. Studied these large and rich number of prayers from antiquity, and liturgy of antiquity, and that definitely feed my own practice and interest in liturgy. I have, sorry to say, certain difficulties with the beginning, because I think you have mixed History 1 and History 2 from yesterday. There is no sense in the past except the sense we put in. And I think we should avoid to mix. There is a sense in history, no, not in History 1, in History 2, a sense you're establishing from certain worldviews and interpreting of. The sentence, history will judge. No, that's a metaphor. To judge something needs a judge. And a judge must be a rational creature or the creator of all rational creatures. And to judge something means to analyze certain things rational and to set up a judgment according to certain criteria. History is apersonal. And this sorry to say, Neoplatonic Hegelian tendency, the word history as the word judgment. Also, in the interest of the victims, there were so many victims in the history of the 20th century, and to declare to them, you got a right by history. No. There are questions of, is it my home taken away from someone? Will I get compensation for my home? My parents were murdered. Who will judge in a very concrete sense that the murderers, and is there a judgment concerning them? So my impression is, sorry to say, that your argument is, and your idea is an argument for separating the things. History, we are interpreting history. I remember and it's extremely necessary to distinguish between history and her interpretation. German reunification. What happened here? That's a question of interpretation. And that can be judged in different ways. But I will think, I don't think that experience how to interpret history when we will ask wonderful questions. The Trinitarian controversy of the 4th century. My own academic teacher and Morris Wiles were convinced the Arians were right. I don't think so. I think Arianism is a quite simple theory in which subordinationism is exaggerated. But Morris Wiles was a highly talented Anglican systematic theologian, and it would be probably of interest to have him here and to argue in favor of. So there is obviously no sense in the disappearance of Arians until in Oxford and Bonn, Neo-Arians appeared in the 20th century. I'm a little bit oversimplifying the problem. So the better theological sentence to Troeltsch, that there is no security in judgments and interpretations about history is the definitive judgment about history and the sense of history will be made at the end, and not by historians.
I'm interested in using the remaining minutes to best effect. There are, I know, 5 questions. So
okay, 5 questions, and I will. Okay.
So first online.
Oh goodness, thank you, Christoph. I'm still thinking hard about the disciplinarization of history in order not to fall again into the trap of supposing that was entirely the work of Protestant theologians at the University of Berlin in the 19th century. And I realized when you came back to Augustine, I think it was in the 3rd lecture, Was it then that you laid out, or was it the one before, History 1 and History 2 for the first time? I think Augustine was in the room when you made that distinction. And I was just wondering if, in fact, anyone before Augustine got to the point that you've just reiterated of saying, well, there's History 1, and then what we really want to do is History 2, and that is interpretation. When I went back and looked at that passage from the City of God that you referenced, what Augustine says is, if I started going through all of these events, I would just be another scriptor historiae, just another writer of history. But in De Doctrina Christiana, famously, in that digression in book 2 about what use Christians can rightfully make of the resources of human learning, he very creatively establishes history as a kind of discipline, doctrina, of things divinely instituted. All the stuff, as it were, of History 1 is God's doing. In that sense, God is, the agent, the maker of history. But History 2 is what Augustine would want to do, and it is an interpretive process, and he sets very strict limits to it, supposing that actually, apart from what one can discern of sacred history through an interpretation of the Bible, we can't really do History 2 at all. Is that where a certain discipline of history begins, and where in a sense its limits are set? Because if it were, that would help explain why actually we've never really quite got out of the theological chance, as you call it, bind, as others might, of trying to do History 2 in Augustine's fashion.
I'd like to hear an answer to that. My question will take you in a different direction, but you presented a very highly conceptual account of what it is to be a theologian and a historian throughout, around a set of intellectual concepts or categories that defines the task. But much of the debate, I think, works at a different level. A number of the people talk about one thing being disinterested, another thing being involved, motivating. And I think that points to an idea of what a historian is or what a theologian is as deeply shaped by affect, by emotion. I wondered then, detheologization might be untenable because secular concepts are shaped by theological ones. That might be one reason, but it might be that there's an effective form of detheologization. Sometimes it's marked by violence and violent antagonism. Often nowadays, it's just marked by sort of who cares. And that difference in effective disposition of different forms of historians might really pull us apart in ways that the conceptual approach mightn't.
Thank you very much for this. This is coming sort of at the same question, but from a different angle. So on the one hand, there are certain trends towards secularization in certain parts of the historical discipline, certainly. But even within what would normally be considered secular historiography, there is a reverse trend in certain schools arguing for things like taking local traditions about God's actions in revolts seriously. So there was a series of articles called The Unbelieved in Historians from 2016 and 17, which argued that the local Indian tradition of a particular revolt in which a god had instigated the revolt and supported them, the historian to begin by saying the god had nothing to do with it, we want to look at just history, we want just the events on the ground that happened. That's actually doing violence to the people. So there's a sort of an anthropological aspect of that as well as an ethical aspect. So on the one hand, from a Christian history side of things, we have people trying to effectively or conceptually secularize, even however difficult that might be. But on the other side of things, in other cultural contexts, trying to reintroduce this concept. I'm wondering how that would fit into what you think of this.
So kind of related. It's it just occurred to me that when the word cults was used, that Augustine was doing a kind of detheologization, which leads to the question: is it always a contest of theology? even between people who are not Christian, Jewish, atheist. Are we always kind of, look, at least Spinozist or whatever.
And finally, Dan. I'll pass. More than enough leftovers on the table for Christoph to do.
I'm allowed to speak the fifth lecture now. Thank you so much. I would like to start with your question, because that remember me that I said I'm so open to integrate lots of paradigms, and the history of emotions paradigm wasn't integrated in these 4 lectures, which is a pity. Yes, and for the publication I have to do, because that's definitely not the last, but a quite interesting paradigm. I'm reading at the moment ancient attempts to categorize emotions. That's quite interesting. There are nice booklets on these. Yes, and you have said something, and that's necessary because it's always linked with emotions. Yes, on this grade between affect and who cares, as you said. Yeah. Then what you said concerning things in other cultures, that's quite interesting. Could you send me in an email, certainly? Because here the limits of my, how to say, Central Europeanity, or I don't know, that I'm so deeply bound, and the chances of being in this region, that's quite wonderful. There is nothing comparable in Europe, but it's necessary to realize. Your question was how to integrate by multiple modernities. That's quite clear, and by a harsh critique of the theology in the secularization model. I'm becoming a little bit tired. It's always extremely difficult to bring in a teleological model in history or in history concepts and your argument. So it's not difficult to integrate. It's quite clear. There are certain directions, and there is not only one direction. Quite clear. And now the question concerning disciplines and disciplinarity. It's wonderful, Mark, that you the provocative statement that the impression that the discipline of history was so deeply coined by Berliners. That this is an impression, especially the third lecture could bring at the table. Yes, I think it's not completely far away, because especially for Middle European behavior, the books produced from those people. And I think that's related, that the function of Berlin is the same like Oxford and Cambridge in the last century. There is clear-cut a kind of Ivy League universities, and in Prussia there was only one Ivy League university, not a number of Ivy League universities, and that this, insofar, the impression is not completely wrong, but at the same time the impression is not correct, because to establish the discipline of history in early modern times, the University of Göttingen is of interest, for example, and multiplicity of universities, especially in England, Scotland, the Scottish Enlightenment, and so far. But the interesting question is Augustine. I think Augustine, the idea to present in this lecture Augustine is quite interesting. I'm always verifying a sentence by Whitehead. The discussion about history are, in a certain sense, footnotes to Augustine. In a certain sense, and that sense you have marked, yeah. And insofar the division between history 1 and history 2, to my impression, is something which in that clarity is at no place expressed before. That's one of there is a certain tendency for radical sentences in Augustine, and perhaps this tendency brought him to express this distinction.
Good intellectual food always leaves us wanting more, but we must transition to physical food for people in the room and life for people online, and perhaps food and drink. But it remains to thank Christoph heartily for engaging with us so fully, insightfully, and with not a little humour, which is very, very welcome. Thank you very much.
One final word, so sort of the coming back to the beginning and the end, just to thank you, Christoph, for actually making the journey within a week. Many of our Northern Hemisphere friends find it a very difficult thing to do, so thank you so much for doing that. You've all been the richer for it, and I suspect you've intimated that you also have been enriched by that process. I'm also very aware that the possibility of your coming to Australia goes way back just before my time as director of the Institute. So I also want to thank Matt Crawford for beginning the process, which was not unonerous, let me say, in the bureaucratic context of ACU. So I'm glad that Matt persevered and that you're finally able to be with us. So once again, I wish you well as you return to Berlin and the centre of the world, and also continue your great work both as a scholar, but also in academic leadership in a very prominent place in Europe, and also to the rest of us who work in the same sort of discipline. So once again, thank you. And I think I've now delayed lunch, but one more round of applause, I suspect.
I feel so deeply enriched by my stay here. And the first impression is that this institute is unique. This institute is unique, and as someone responsible for not the arrangement of the whole system of academic institutions in Germany, but that there is nothing comparable, and that one of the possibilities to express impression is to copy. to copy or to try to copy. That's my first impression. Knowing the model of institutes for advanced study, we thought a long about changing these institutes, but that's unique, and I'm deeply impressed about the chances that institute gives. And then I have to confess, I'm especially thankful for, normally there is a certain reason that since 2017 the Regensburg lectures aren't published, because I was not sure. Shall I change? Shall I widen up? And the wonderful thing is, my wife yesterday wrote and said to me, now you're more sure how to proceed with the book. And that's the best thing you could do for me. So many thanks. That was a moving experience. And I'm to the director and to Matt and to all of you, especially thankful also to those people who followed such a long time to completely absurd times in their own countries at the screen. That's quite wonderful. And greetings, and I hope to see all of you at a certain point, at a certain place in bodily presence. Emotions. Yeah, good appetite. Thank you.